So welcome to the What Does Sociocracy Offer to Ending Classism webinar. This is presented by Sociocracy For All. I'm Jerry Koch-Gonzalez, and my partner in this webinar is Ann Phillips. Ann, why don't you introduce yourself and even say more words about who you are, if you like?
Sure. Yeah. My name's Ann Phillips, and I work with Class Action. We are a nonprofit that helps advance equity and justice by exposing classism as one of the hidden anchors that holds inequality in place. And we do this through popular education workshops and organizational consulting, also with first-generation college students, and some work with nonprofits, specifically a new initiative called Staffing the Mission. And we are based in Boston, but we have a national network of 24 amazing facilitators and consultants. One of them is on this webinar. Hi, Joni. Some more may be joining. But we work with cross-class and multiracial teams to help undo the classism. And a little bit about me, I've been here 5 years. I myself come from a working class background, currently middle class, because Class Action is kind enough to pay a livable wage, and first gen college student when I went to school, and my identity now would be called a class straddler. Thanks, Jerry.
All right, I think I could probably echo the being class straddler myself. I grew up in until I was 8 years old in Cuba, middle class family. Came to the United States and immediately dropped down into sort of lower middle class, working class kind of consciousness. And now as an older person, I'm sort of back up into the middle class, or perhaps even upper middle class, at least in terms of resource and capacity. And I'll just state the sort of what the story is of this webinar and what we're going to do. So we know the pain of living in a society of extreme inequality. And even when we organize ourselves towards a world of greater equality, we tend to focus on what is wrong rather than what could be. And yet, within our own activist organizations, we reenact power over systems, either because we allow unexamined classist dynamics to play out, or we create organizational structure and use decision-making methods that don't actually include the voices of all the organization's members. So in this webinar, we're going to briefly describe sociocracy and classism, present what sociocracy offers towards ending classism, and discuss the challenges of ending classism within sociocracy and the challenges of implementing sociocracy in a classist world. Ann and I are going to take turns presenting information, and then we're going to go into a dialogue with each other, and then open up to comments and questions from all of you. We probably have 45 minutes to an hour of between presentation and a dialogue between Ann and I before we open up, and we'll have anywhere from 15 minutes to half an hour of question and answer, and then we'll sort of formally close the webinar, but still open up to anyone who wants to keep talking. Okay. So we're going to start with I will start with the explanation of what is sociocracy. I'm assuming that there are a number of people here who don't know what sociocracy is, don't even know the word, that have come here through whatever means. And then Ann will take a turn and explain classism to anybody who's come here through sociocracy, perhaps, or any other way, doesn't really know what the concept of classism is about. So we'll do those two presentations, and then I will talk about, how sociocracy impacts classism. So in your meetings, do you get frustrated, confused, annoyed? Didn't we already talk about this? What are we doing here? Could you just listen? So what happens for us during our meetings? Here, because I thought I was going to do this. So what does sociocracy, how does sociocracy respond? First of all, one of the most core elements that we do is rounds. A round is very simply people taking turns to speak, one after the other. And what is meaningful about this in terms of equality, in terms of justice of we all matter, is that it creates a safe space for each person to talk and a peaceful space to talk. You know that you're not going to be interrupted. The impact is we have an effective use of time, and there are just more ideas are brought out when we can speak without the sense of competition, of people cutting in and interrupting each other. Everyone's voice matters, and this is the essential element of sociocracy, about how do we create organization, how do we create decision making, how do we create a learning organization that really embodies that everyone's voice matters. And rounds is the most elemental thing to do. It's an ancient tradition, and we love that it's part of sociocracy. So another question, what are we doing here? So what are we doing? We are organized in sociocracy in groups of people working together, what we call circles. Even the word sociocracy, where it comes from is socios, those who associate together, and ocracy, governance. So governance by the socios, sociocracy. It's the same kind of pronunciation as sociology. So being organized in circles, in small groups of people where everyone can hear each other. What does this bring for us? Full authority in the circles. The principle in sociocracy is of subsidiarity. That means the spreading out authority to the lowest or the most grassroots level of organization that is possible. So it is not management from the top, but management from each group of people, each circle at the level that they are operating in within the organization. Important here is also that each of these different circles or teams has their own authority, their own aim, and their own domain. Aim meaning what's their purpose, and domain is what is the range of authority that they have to make decisions. What is in a sense, the freedom within limits that each group of people in an organization have. So that's the organization with circles. And so if you have a larger organization than just 5 or 6 people, then you're going to have linkages between those teams, those circles of people. In sociocracy, the way we can create an organization with many people is that they're organized in circles. Each circle has a leader and a delegate, and those 2 people serve on the circle that's next, and that's connected to them, more abstract, more broad, higher level, if you will. And so every circle is connected to every other circle in the organization through at least 2 people. This allows the information flow to happen throughout the organization. Everything can get handled. Everyone's voice can be heard because the information can flow, the influence of power can flow, and it's completely transparent. All the minutes of all the circles are available to all. It's an open book bookkeeping. Everything is transparent to people in the organization. So that was organizational structure. The next piece is, how do we make decisions? Didn't we already talk about this? You keep going over and over again. So in sociocracy, we make decisions by consent. And what that means is decisions are made when no one has objections. There's a key difference here between what we mean by a preference and an objection. So I may prefer this, but I don't have an objection to that. And that's what allows us to move forward, that we don't need to have perfect solutions every time, but just good enough for now, safe enough to try solutions so that we can do something and learn from our actions. So it makes decisions easier, and we are clear about what we decide. The next and last element I want to talk about here is how sociocracy supports organizations being learning organizations. How do we continue to evolve and adapt and not get stuck? So the main principle is feedback. Feedback to people, feedback to process. So every meeting has an evaluation at the end of the meeting, what went well, what could be improved, suggestions for improvement. When we do selections of people to roles, whether it's selection to a leader, or selection to a delegate, selection for someone who's going to play a facilitator role, we are doing that in an open process, not secret ballot. So we're hearing why people are nominating each other for certain roles. So lots more information shared in selection processes. Anybody who plays a role in an organization that sooner or later has a role improvement process where you get together and the person whose focus it is says, here's what I think I've done well, here's where I think I could improve. And everybody in the team then reflects back also their perceptions of what that person has done well and what they could improve upon. And then they look at what are the plans for development that the focus person could take on to do what they do well even more, and to do what they not do so well, improve on that. We also do feedback about any product or content. Any policy that we make that governs our work has a term end date so that we can have a time where we consciously evaluate it. Every workflow can be evaluated so you can see how we can improve it, make it more effective. Feedback is a built-in support system. With every circle being linked to another circle, which means there's at least two people that are serving on any circle that has a broader perspective or a more narrow perspective than your own. And so there's feedback that can flow from what we call the parent circle or the child circle or a helping circle. So those are the key elements. Clear method of decision-making, transparent organizational structure of linked circles, and to learn and evolve together. Consent decision-making, the organizational structure of linked circles, and processes of evaluation and improvement. So we're shifting from power over to shared power. And so many of you may never have heard of sociocracy before. So who is doing sociocracy? Cooperatives, co-housing communities, nonprofits, neighborhood parliaments. You see the big picture of the students. This is in India, the largest sociocratic organization in the world. Is thousands of 6 to 18-year-old students meeting in circles in their villages and their schools. Independent schools and for-profit businesses. And who is Sociocracy For All? Sociocracy For All is a nonprofit. We're also, our main purpose is to just share information about sociocracy as widely as we can. We produce videos. You can see them, a lot of them online through our website. We produce articles and other kinds of resources. We produce a study group curriculum that is downloadable, a 6-session series of that. We have a training program, on online kind of live organization training program, Sociocracy leadership training, and we produce webinars like this. Good. All right. So we're back here in the whole group, and Anne, you want to take over from here?
Sure. Yeah. So I learned about sociocracy from Jerry. I attended a day-long, 2-day workshop actually a few years ago, and it was early in my time with class action. So yeah, I really appreciate that quick overview, Jerry. And a lot of the principles around non-hierarchy are things that I have put into practice, even though class action is not a sociocratic organization at this point. But so I'll just give you a little background. Kind of our mission statement is that we inspire action to end classism and extreme inequality by providing change makers with tools, training, inspiration to raise awareness, shift cultural beliefs about social class, build cross-class solidarity and transform institutions and systems. Yeah, our work came about in a time when there was a lot of people talking about gender and race and all of the isms, which are all obviously important things to talk about. But there was this one piece that seemed to be missing. And our founders, Jerry being one of those folks, thought this is a problem. So I'm going to just go over a few terms. What is class? The relative social rank in terms of education, income, wealth, status, power, aspirations, and expectations. Class is not just how much money you make. It does include economic capital, but then there's also cultural capital and social capital. And we could even add educational capital into that. And so what is classism? So this is the institutional, cultural, and individual practices and beliefs that assign different value to people according to their socioeconomic class. And it's an economic system that creates excessive inequality and causes basic needs to go unmet. Another way I talk about this is really the myth of meritocracy in at least the United States. There is a belief that people deserve where they're at and what their lot in life is. Subconsciously, many times, if you walk past somebody that doesn't have a home, you think, oh, they must have really done something wrong. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we see people like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and we're like, wow, they must have really worked hard. But in reality, when we look at the economy and numbers, we know that there were a lot of things behind both of those things. So Class Action's vision then to move beyond classism is a world where everybody's basic needs are met, where we can treat people from every background, race, class status, and rank with dignity and respect. We support the development of people to their full potential, reducing vast differences in income, wealth, and access to resources, and ensuring everyone has a voice in the decisions that affect them. And I think in this vision statement, you'll see a lot of parallels with this, what sociocracy has to offer as a tool of governance. Just kind of as we are talking about class and classism today, just to note that there are many different circles of classism. So there's the individual, that is our internalized feelings about ourselves and about how we interact with other people. The interpersonal, these are how we interact, our internal biases that affect how we interact with people from different class backgrounds. There are cultural, pervasive beliefs and ideologies, such as the myth of meritocracy, the American dream. And then organizational, especially since most organizations tend to operate on a very middle class and white status quo. Class can be embedded into the policies and practices, and that's some stuff we'll talk about a little later in this webinar. And then systemic, so policies and practices that are embedded in our major social institutions that benefit the more class advantaged folks at the expense of people on the lower end of the spectrum. And then I just, we always want to point out that class action does not rank the isms, and especially when it comes to class and race, they're really linked in a very mucky intersection. But we believe, and the folks we do work around race with, we know that if we can talk about these together, that it's going to create more equity.
One of the ways that I think about all the work of social change is from the Gandhian Framework of transformation, of having three different elements. One is the challenge program, like what are we against? So the call to, it's about reducing harm, for example, of the capitalist system, extractive economy. How do we stop that? How do we reduce the harm, challenge the harm that is being happening through that system? The second aspect is the constructive program. How do we build the world that we want to see? And for me, sociocracy is an example of that. It's a framework of organizational structuring, of decision-making that does embody the world that I would like to see and where everyone's voice matters. And the third area is the personal transformation. How do we embody the change we want to see? And for me, that's the work of Class Action and other organizations that work to build our awareness of classism, sexism, all the oppressions, and also to build not only our consciousness, but our skills in communication, like nonviolent communication or other forms like that, that are working to do our personal transformation. Because I think as we'll get into, I think the discussion later is, sociocracy creates a framework in which equality can happen. But then we still bring ourselves into it. We still bring whatever baggage we are bringing from all the trauma of living in oppressive society. So there's lots of parts of tools of sociocracy that I think support the sense of everyone's voice matters. And I think I just want to go to the biggest frame, which is sometimes we say in sociocracy that an organization owns itself. It doesn't have external owners like shareholders. It doesn't even have owners like in a workers' co-op where the workers own it. The organization owns itself as a whole because of the way all the individuals are within circles that are making decisions by consent, and then the circles are linked to each other in circles so that there is a consent process that ties in the whole organization. In that kind of a context, where in a sense the organization owns itself, the decisions of the organization are not going to be made solely for the benefit of shareholders, even solely for the benefit of worker owners. They're going to be made in the context of the whole community in which that organization lives. Because if I'm a member of that organization, I'm not going to support extravagant pay for the higher levels of the organization. I'm not going to support extractive profit sharing for shareholders. I'm not going to support the moving of the community, of the organization from the community in which I live with my neighbors to some other part of the world and leave people unemployed at home. So there's lots of elements that when we have this form of consent decision-making and everybody's voice counts, that we bring the sense of community more together. We would not support the extremes of pay, of disconnection from the land and the impacts of what we do. We're not going to likely to consent to be making junk in the world. We're going to want to be making stuff that has meaning to us. So all those, that big picture, I think, is the most central, I guess, for me. Then there are different practices within sociocracy that really support equivalence. Rounds being the most obvious and simple one. When we do a round, everyone's voice is heard. And those of us who tend to speak a lot wind up having to check ourselves to okay, limit my time of speaking, and I only get one round at a time, one turn at a time in a round. I don't get to interrupt other people. I don't get to speak at length and at length and at length. And those of us who aren't used to speaking up, there's a challenge of finding our voice, of claiming our space to here's a space for our voice where we're not going to get interrupted. We're not going to have somebody from a higher class background overtalk us, etc. Those again are both directions that need the consciousness and skill development to grow. Again, the kind of work that Anne and Class Action do to how do I find my voice if I haven't had it already? How do I recognize the overpower of my voice and step back and share the time and space with others. Decisions by consent. So obviously decisions by consent means everyone's saying, I don't have any objection here. So everyone's voice matters. It is not majority vote, so it's not winners and losers. And we know what majority vote gets us sometimes, as in the United States government. Not exactly an embodiment of effectiveness or efficiency or values of equivalence and care for all. It's also not consensus, in which, and there are many, many different ways of applying consensus, but too often within consensus, a lack of structure allows the unexamined ways of domination to show up, and allows the tyranny of the minority. Those who don't like something get to have a lot of power without necessarily dialoguing with the rest of the group. So consensus often privileges the individual more than the group, instead of the both and, of group and individual. And the organizational structure of the linked circles is important because we're playing roles at different levels. If we have an organization with 100 or 500 people, how do all of those folks actually share equivalence in the organization? They share equivalence at each area in which they work. So if there's frontline workers, they share equivalence about how they do their frontline work, and they get to decide how they do their work, because they're making policy that affects their own work. And then they're linked to the next level of organization of that unit, so that there they are sharing with the other departments of that organization anything that's impacting each other, and making decisions of things that that impact multiple groups at a time. And you can do that in a sense as a fractal, that the many different levels of an organization can exist, but the voice still flows. So if something is happening in one area of the organization that is negatively impacting others, there's still a way to raise that voice and ask for a change in that policy or an examination of that policy so that it continues to benefit the whole. Is there more that I want to say on this? I think those are probably the main points that I wanted to make just as a starter. And from here, let Anne raise some questions for me and we can talk some more. And then open it up. Anne, is anything coming up for you that you want to say now? You're muted. Your turn to be muted.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot of great things in sociocracy that can reduce classism, but I am interested to hear from you, like, especially with more experience under your belt doing this work, how does sociocracy not address classism? Yeah, what are ways that
sociocracy does not address classism?
Yeah, or what are, in practice, what are ways that show up, that classism shows up?
I think the main way that it shows up is that we can create, we can create a circle of people and we can do rounds which has the structure of equivalence, but then sociocracy does not so directly address why are you the different quality of the voices in the circle.
Mm-hmm.
That talking to somebody from Thailand and talking about implementing sociocracy in Thailand, where quite a large number of the population is used to just, we follow the elders, and to actually speak up is almost insulting. So how do we shift that so that those voices are welcome, both the people who are not used to speaking up and the elders welcoming the voices of the community? So there's there is that tension. Again, it's sort of like, what do I carry from my past that gives me big voice or little voice? And that's where I think it's important to connect sociocracy to consciousness raising, awareness kind of programs like yours in class action, so that we witness what it's like to come into that space, that we're not equal when we come into a space. The structure says we're equal, but we don't feel that way personally because of whatever our heritage is. So both the kind of consciousness of the impacts of oppression and privilege, and also just a skill development of that, that something like nonviolent communication can bring us to, when we can sort of more clearly speak, this is what's going on for me. These are my needs. Let me put what's going on for me on the table. You put what's going on for you on the table, and now we can collectively figure out, what to do with it. But it's not inherent in just a basic structure of sociocracy, except for the piece about feedback, because that's where the evolution comes in, where we get to evaluate a meeting and say, I'm uncomfortable with some things that happen in this meeting. I'm noticing that some people don't speak that much, some don't speak a lot. We've been witnessing this over a number of meetings, and I wonder what we can do to strengthen the voices of some of the people in our group. And that goes back to the role improvement feedback. How do we support people to develop? Send them to a workshop with class action, for example.
It makes me think of an organization where we've worked with recently, where they were the people in the hourly wage roles at this large social service organization didn't want to do the popular education activities that we were doing, because they were so afraid of having to speak out about the classism that they feel they're experiencing, and for fear of retribution. And it does, if for example, all your jobs have been low paid hourly wage jobs, and you've had bosses who are very hierarchical and maybe retaliatory in previous jobs, that is another piece of baggage that folks will bring. So some of the internalized shame, or not wanting to speak up, just being shut down if folks are realizing that they're in a room full of predominantly white upper middle class people. So it's not easy within hierarchical organizations, and I can imagine it's a little easier in sociocracy, but yeah, having the lenses is what's going to make us, just being able to, sometimes just peeling off that first onion layer opens you up for a lot more growth, is what I've seen with organizations we work with.
The transition from a hierarchical, power over organization to sociocracy has that challenge, because it takes time to trust. It takes time to notice that you can speak up and there isn't a retaliation, that you're not going to get fired.
Mm-hmm.
And it does require that the organization really sort of adopt sociocracy in its bylaws, in its structure, in its ownership frame, so that there isn't, what do I want to say, doing sociocracy within a unit of a hierarchical organization might be sweet within that unit. Mm-hmm. But then if something changes at a higher level where there isn't sociocracy being applied, they appoint a new leader of your unit, bingo, what you were doing can just change overnight.
Right.
And that, so in that context, it's really important, so it's important in a buyout process. For example, when somebody's shifting from a family-owned business to a worker-owned cooperative, that all the systems of equality are set in structure, and at least on paper and legally it's there, and then it takes time for us to walk ourselves into that and fully believe it through practice and through trust, and through feedback. We had one little example. There was somebody in our in my co-housing community here who, in rounds, really hard to hold rounds, would frequently interrupt. And we, over time, kept giving her feedback. And eventually she became a leader of a different circle. And I heard from people in that circle that she was like the police. She always had rounds. Nobody could speak outside of a round, and did it very rigidly. In a sense, she had learned, and great, she had learned about the importance of rounds, but then also was applying it almost too hard, not allowing the human element to be present. So I think that's the kind of the process that we go through sometimes. Is like, first it's hard for us to do it, then we become like police about how it's supposed to be done. And then when we get more comfortable, more sense of mastery, then it becomes more relaxed and we find our voice, we find our place.
Another mention about, like you said, the being more difficult coming from a hierarchical organization to sociocracy. One of the projects I mentioned earlier that we have is called Staffing the Mission. And we're really working to help nonprofits not replicate the oppressions that they are fighting externally, to not replicate those internally within their own staffs. And Davey has been, Davey's on the call here, so I may invite him to add if I don't encapsulate this correctly, but we did a big survey last year, or this past year, of nonprofits to find out, you know, where are the obstacles, who's doing well, and we did find one of the main key themes was that organizations that started non-hierarchically just reported better, you know, less classist organizations, and those that had started with a lot of hierarchy, it just makes it really difficult to, you know, take that stuff out of the bones of the organizations. But we have to do that if we want to move towards more equity. So, you know, maybe the structure of sociocracy could be a good tool to, you know, it's more specific than we're going to be non-hierarchical. It's like, no, this is a very specific tool you can use to consciously shift your organization. I have another question for you. You're welcome to respond to that as well. But
I think I agree with you. You know, the intentionality is key. Intentionality and a process for feedback. So you do your best to set a direction, and it's going to be imperfect. Know that it's going to be imperfect, and that you need to do a process of feedback so you can keep shifting it along as you go.
Yeah. I wanted to know from your, you know, work with Sociocracy For All and all the groups you've worked with, does the sociocracy skew towards any certain class?
I think it's really dependent upon where it's being implemented and who the initiators are. So, you know, just the odd places of history in the United States. And in part, in a lot of the rest of the world, one way of sociocracy went out into the world was through the connection of people who were doing nonviolent communication. Because there was a move within those folks who were trainers in that to think about how they could embody the sense of equality that comes from the work of nonviolent communication as an organization. So people around the world got trained in that, and a lot of those folks around the world are coming from middle class, more dominant person, you know, white or whatever, even around the world. In the United States, co-housing communities, as one kind of intentional community, has been a very strong place where sociocracy has spread. And by its nature, you have to have money to buy a house, you know, and co-housing is not any cheaper than ordinary housing. So when people are coming together to build housing, in many of the communities are from more affluent places, that's a barrier, and it's already a class difference in who is practicing sociocracy in co-housing communities. On the other hand, you have some place like India, where the largest sociocratic organization in the world is among youth. So it's 6 to 18-year-olds, and you get how they are set up is a neighborhood in a village of with no more than 30 children come together as a circle. And then they link to other neighborhood circles of children. And so they create the whole structure where there's neighborhood circles, a village circle that is made up of the representatives of the neighborhood circles and regional circles all the way up to the level of the state. And it's thousands of children. And in many of these, they are children who are not literate. So they are doing selection process for their own leaders without ability to write. So they're just talking it through. They're just saying, I would nominate this person to be and they call him prime minister, for this and this reasons. And they have those selection processes. So in that context, it is not at all the middle class people who are doing sociocracy. So it varies according to where it kind of enters. Another place where sociocracy has entered is the software industry, particularly the agile programmers, because there's a lot of connection between how agile programs need to work, collectively, and being able to do something and learn from it and do something else again. That is connected to a lot of the principles of sociocracy. Agile programmers can't be managed by corporate bosses who don't understand the process. Trying to think of others. I think in the United States, I would say absolutely more white, more middle to upper middle class. But around the world, it really varies. There's a significant contingent of people practicing sociocracy in Brazil. I think in Brazil, they really span the range much more than what I've witnessed in the United States in terms of class participation.
I do want to also open it up. I know I earlier said I invited Davey to add anything that anything from the survey and the work he's been doing on the Staffing the Mission project.
Sure. Hi.
Hi, Davey.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about the point that you brought up, that the organizations where we've interviewed people, where people are most successfully moving towards more equitable pay, are organizations that had that plan from the beginning. And likewise, the organizations that have most equitable decision-making are ones that were prioritizing that from the beginning. The only thing that I would add is that those two things are very deeply intertwined. So if an organization has like pretty average, typical hierarchical pay structures and hierarchical decision-making, and then starts thinking, oh, what would be cool is to have more inclusive decision-making, but we don't want to talk about pay, that's not necessarily that sustainable, because when you get people involved in decision-making, they're going to want to be paid more fairly. And I think to some extent it may go the other way as well, that you can't really get to more equal pay without doing some more equal decision-making, because if people are in positions of power and also the most highly paid, they might want to continue being paid that highly and continuing having that much power.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a challenge. One of the frames I just want to share about sociocracy. So in a for-profit organization, the pay structure would include, so in a for-profit organization, there would likely be investors, and you can have investors in sociocracy. But what do the investors get? They get a fixed rate of return for having put their money in, and they get a variable rate of return for how well the company is doing. What do the workers get? The workers get a fixed rate of pay, whatever their salary is, and they get a variable rate of return, how well the company is doing. So both investors and workers have a benefit that is shared between them. They all want the organization to do well. And when you're working through the consent process, the investors would have a voice in the board of directors of the organization, but they'd only have a voice that is shared in consent, with consent with the other people who are on that board of directors, which includes representation from the workers. So there's no decision that can be made that doesn't involve, all the players, all the stakeholders in that sense. But getting there is the challenge of being able to be willing to experiment and to take that risk and to have the level of consciousness of wanting to live in a more egalitarian world. So there's some good questions in the chat.
Yes.
Do you want
me to read them?
If
So
you've
the
got one,
first one is, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a long question, but I'll read it. I'm wondering about power and responsibility differences in communities where there are landowners and renters in the decision-making groups together, where renters can more easily leave, so there's more freedom on their part, perceived by owners, and more responsibility on the part of the owners, property insurance coverage, taxes, etc. Can sociocracy work with these types of levels within an eco-village intentional community?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've seen communities that are not able to deal with that very well and communities that can. When you're talking about an eco-village or a co-housing community, you don't have as much control about who lives, who is the organization. If you think of an organization where people are hired, then everyone who's been selected into the organization where people are hired has gone through certain criteria to be there, including what are their skills in doing the particular work and how well they communicate. Do you want to work with these people? But when you live in a living situation, you don't have the same kind of level of control. You may like me, but I also may come with a partner. I may also come with a grown-up son or a sister that lives with me. They're not owners of the house. Maybe I'm the only owner of that unit, but you get all those other people. So there's not a key principle in sociocracy is decisions are made by people in a circle who get to choose who they are in that circle. You can't impose somebody into a group of decision makers. There has to be a both and. The individual wants to be part of the group, and the group says, yes, we want you to be part of this group. So the challenge is when you have a community where there's owners and there's renters, and they don't necessarily start from the point of view of being one community. I live in a cooperative housing community, Pioneer Valley Co-Housing in Amherst, Massachusetts. The community is larger than the homeowners. So that's a very, very important concept, which not all co-housing communities really understand. The community is larger than the homeowners. So by law, homeowners have certain kinds of rights, because that's just baked into the government, into the governments of how a condominium operates, for example. But we operate on the principle that the community is larger. So renters, if they are accepted into the community, like any other person, have full equal rights in all the decision making. Technically, they wouldn't have the same rights about the budget, but we don't pay attention to that in our meetings. Only if there was a crisis would we have to go to only homeowners can vote here, which has never happened in our 20-something year history. So the renters, when you have the concept that the other people besides the actual legal title holder are part of the community, then the culture of participation and consent and everyone's voice matters can be strong enough to hold the kinds of concerns that are being raised in this question. That the renters can be empathetic about the issues that homeowners might have that might be different from theirs. And the homeowners can be empathetic about issues that renters might have that are different from theirs as homeowners. So it's the quality of connection that becomes really important. And so again, the level of classism consciousness, the level of nonviolent communication skills that the group has makes a huge difference in that.
And yeah, and I'll just add, in hearing that question, owners versus renters, is that a class-based, classification as well? And having worked with lots of different types of organizations and groups, there's something about going through the process of doing the cross-class community building work together that brings up this like people having sympathy for people's where they're at. And a lot of times just because homeowners now own property, their class background of maybe being, you know, having chronic housing issues as a child may be why they might be more, you know, passionate about where they're at now as a homeowner. And, you know, renters, there's just so much more beyond being ownership and renting, that when you can apply a class lens, a lot more is revealed, and it's not as scary as people think it is, and it usually does result in a stronger cross-class community. And I would also add there are things, you know, beyond just the, you know, these types of disputes that communities and organizations can really focus on, and that is just even like, when are our meetings? Is it during dinner time? Are we serving food? Is there childcare accessible? There's just many things that I can share out after this webinar with folks. One of our organizational checklists for you know, taking an internal look at your community or organization to make sure that you can remove some of these invisible walls and obstacles that we don't always see.
Ready for questions?
Yeah, more questions. Sheila, do you want to ask your question out loud?
Yes. Can I mention what I wrote into the chat first about where sociocracy has been used?
Go ahead.
Yeah, because you were saying that a lot of the groups in the United States tend to be more white and middle class. There's a group in far western North Carolina that's definitely not definitely not just white and middle class. Group of grassroots organizations that are linked in circles, working for food security, and another one for low-cost housing. And I think the two are linking to each other, and they're growing grassroots leaders by the bucket load there, and accomplishing amazing things. So, okay, my question has to do with nonprofit boards. I know in theory how it can work, but I'm curious if anybody knows of maybe examples where there was a nonprofit board where it's a typical thing in a nonprofit board is that part of the job description is not just to raise money for the organization, but to be a major contributor to the organization. That creates a class-based power imbalance can create a class-based power imbalance with the rest of the organization. And I'm curious if anybody knows of any organizations where sociocracy has helped that.
Mm-hmm. And you want to respond to just how class action thinks about this question?
Yeah. Well, I've worked in organizations where, you know, it was all about, we got to get rich people on our board. Thankfully, I haven't worked in one of those organizations for a while, because I've worked in organizations where we want to have representative community on our board, which doesn't always mean rich people. And I've seen it done and been on boards where you either have to like give or get a certain amount, which also is incredibly classist when some members don't have, you know, they have to hustle to get 10 friends to give $50 to make their minimum. So this organization and the previous organization I worked at, the way we talk about it is make a gift that's meaningful to you, and ask that the organization is in your top 3 charities, or 2 if you also give to a church or a religious institution. So it's going to create a different kind of board, but if we're working towards more equity and community-based power, then that's what we would recommend. I don't think the opera or the libraries are operating under that model, but yeah, that's what we would recommend. And Jerry, do you know of any?
I was just going to say, at least how Sociocracy For All works is we are a member organization. So we have numbers of people involved in doing, they're all volunteer except for Jennifer, who's on staff. So every member is asked to give $50 a year as a sort of fixed amount, and a variable contribution of anything from $1 to thousands, whatever they choose to give. So there's kind of that principle of the fixed amount and the variable amount. And then we also say no one turned away for lack of funds. And we've got several people who have bartered or done something else to contribute besides paying the actual $50 cash when that's not something that was really available to them. And what is, the whole notion of philanthropy is one that needs to be challenged and looked at in this context. As we shift, from philanthropy of doing to people and doing with our organizations, that, one of the notions in sociocracy would be that you can have a funders circle. The philanthropists, the people who are giving significant money, could be in a circle. And they could have representation on the top circle, on the board of directors of the organization. So once again, funders have a voice, but it's only a consent voice along with everybody else who's in that. And that what we need in our boards of directors is not just people with money, but people who will bring the needed connection to our community at large that we need. So for example, being in a co-housing community where we've got some land, it would be lovely if in our board of directors, we had someone who was a permaculture expert, because then they're bringing that consciousness about how to use the land, how to relate to the land in a way that would be really useful for us. It would be great if we had somebody from another co-housing community sitting on our board, because then we'd have that exchange with them about what are you doing, what are we doing. So there are I guess I would just challenge that notion of boards as simply money raisers. Really, what are all the resources that can influence our organization for the better, but also think, how does our organization influence all the other organizations? So that permaculture expert who might sit on our board then goes back and brings, their consciousness of sociocracy and the application of permaculture in a community back to their permaculture association and influence other permaculture experts who connect to others. So it's a work in progress, Sheila.
That's an excellent question in the chat that I would like for you to get into.
Okay.
I'll read it.
Yeah.
Because there have been a few new messages since. From some people seem to interpret equal voice as giving everyone the same right to compete. How can we use sociocracy and class awareness to shift toward cooperation in decision making? So the same right to compete is one frame, and we're all cooperating is the other frame. How can sociocracy support that? That's the question, the way I understand.
Let's see if I'm understanding what that means. So for me, sociocracy offers everyone the opportunity to cooperate. So maybe the question is, if we have a sociocratic organization, are we then competing with other organizations? Which in this current world, the answer is yes, that's what's happening. I don't see it as a right to compete as much as a transition time. Again, that my sense of vision, kind of the same phrase we used to use in the old days about the problem with corporations, the interlocking system of directorates, that all the corporations would kind of band together to either explicitly or implicitly, oppress the rest of us. But what is the interlocking system of directorates among cooperators? So that the food co-op is now linked to the community-supported agriculture, that is connected to the bakery and cafe, that is linked to the transport cooperative. That so how do we all link to each other for mutual benefit? And we bring more and more people into circles of connection. when I think of, one of the original thoughts around class was noticing that for wealthy people, security is in the wealth. Okay, I bought a house and it turned out to be, this is not a great neighborhood for me. All right, I just buy a house somewhere else. You can just do that, because wealth allows you to keep looking for your needs through your purchasing power. People who don't have that kind of purchasing power are going to look to meet their needs through community, through their sense of connection to each other. It's like here, I mean, in many neighborhoods, but here in particularly in our community, our charger for our laptop broke. Does anybody have one? Bingo, somebody comes over, just, says, sure, I've got one, you can have this. It's the cup of sugar thing.
Mm-hmm.
We just share with each other. People just ask for what they need and people offer that because we have that sense of connection with each other. So how do we keep expanding the circles of connection? And that's what what I'm hoping that it can do.
And can I add that did you have something to follow up on that, Jennifer?
Can I real quick, just
Yeah.
one other thing is that it's easily overlooked what consent decision-making method does to a group. Because if I enter the meeting, any meeting, knowing that we will all have to consent, we have to shift into cooperation. There's no way, you don't get very far with a mindset of competition. There's just no way it's gonna catch up on you. And for instance, one way that shows that I find really important is elections are also made by consent. Jerry mentioned that at the beginning in passing, but it is huge what it does to the culture of an organization, because it means that like a divisive person is not going to be able to get into office.
Mm-hmm.
So that changes your mindset right there. So it's not, it is on the one hand that the system forces you to think about, like to be considerate and think about the others. But then what happens more long term is the getting used to that and starting out as that. You don't have to hit the wall of like, oh, I don't get consent here. At some point you ease into it and you're like, right, I actually have to shift gears completely and start from a cooperative mindset. And that's what happens over time.
Yeah. And so when it comes to like the class dynamics, when we, the long view of our work would be to really disrupt those narratives of deservedness that I mentioned earlier, the myth of meritocracy. Right now, when we aren't fluent in talking about money and class, it really, those corporations that have all the power are winning, because we get to all say, oh, we're all middle class. But the points that Jerry mentioned about where we find our resources and our strengths, we can realize that, we know that everybody doesn't have enough, and that's not great. And that's not a value that, we want to see. And some people have too much. So yeah, I think, taking a approach to reduce classism, the end game is really to end, harmful extractive competition.
There's another great question in the chat if you guys are ready.
Yeah, good. And we could open up to people raising their own questions. Or...
Yes, we can. I mean, people are asking questions in the chat.
And they could voice it themselves.
And that's true, but this one is well put, so I think it's maybe even best to read it. Can you speak to the role of facilitation in ensuring the power of the group, lifting all voices, encouraging participants to make space or take space, etc.? How central is the role of the facilitator in sociocracy? How are we building the capacity and skill base of our facilitators and other forms of community leadership in this model? Also, have you found talking in rounds can cause a drop-off in engagement rather than perhaps a more dynamic but well-facilitated conversation? So do you have it, or do you need a...
I've got a couple. You have something?
No. Yes, of course I do, but it's yes.
I'm happy to explain further as well if it's helpful.
Yeah, a number of different kinds of things to say about that. One is having a structured process like a round means that on many levels there's less pressure on the facilitator, because the rest of the members know what they're doing and know how they go, when their turn is going to talk if we're doing rounds. So it's more of a unified process than all the power, all the responsibility, not even power necessarily, but responsibility being on the facilitator. So when everyone knows the process, it's not only the facilitator can say, hey, can you hold that thought? We were doing a round, if somebody speaks kind of out of turn. And it's in the process again of evaluating a meeting, of saying, yeah, I noticed it's so-and-so, that you didn't speak that much, and I really would like to hear more of your voice. What's going on for you about that? Is there a way that we can support you? Enter into that dialogue with people who are not speaking as much or people who are speaking more. So it's not just the facilitator who has that role, but the whole group has the role of supporting each other through the process of feedback about how they are going to participate in a group. So that was my first thoughts.
Ask him whether he wants to add.
And Mark or Anne, I don't know if you wanted to add here, Mark. If you want to raise a question in another way or another aspect of it that I didn't speak to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's both like a long tradition of people speaking in a circle, and I want to appreciate and honor that, and that it's not unique to sociocracy, as I think you've been really aware and clear about, which is great. And at the same time, there's a lot of people are used to processing differently. There's a lot of neurodivergence. There's a lot of different ways that people like to engage in groups, and I can imagine. I could just imagine just going around in a circle rather than something that is maybe more dynamic and more engaging. I could imagine there being a fall off in participation. So that's where that question comes from. And I like this. We do facilitation training, and I like what you're saying about that. It's because of the model. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be an amazing facilitator. You just have to make sure that things are following a process, rather than it being this specialized skill role. But the other question that was embedded in there is, is there anything that's actually building, is there anything within the model that's consciously building leadership in the community and building capacity? How is it, is there something in there where you're seeing skills getting shared rather than entrenched with particular people?
Yeah. What was the other point? I wanted to respond to what you said, which I lost the other point, but building leadership, when we do the processes over and over, okay, now I remember with consent decision making, you can make decisions, you can decide by consent to make decisions in any other way. So you can say, okay, let's have a consent that for this thing, we're going to do a vote, which might be appropriate when it's really matters of preference, that aren't really based upon, a rational argument that we can come up with the best idea. You can also say, okay, let's have a 15-minute popcorn time. You can just speak at will. And then what's important is to come back out of that free-form style back into a round. Now let's reestablish equivalence. Where are we now after having this free-form style for a while? So you don't lose the equivalence, because in free-form style is inherently most likely not equivalent. It might generate some good creativity that you want, but always come back to the round to bring back the equivalence. And it's been mostly my experience that people just start calming down as we do the rounds, and much more comfortable in having their, finding their voice, and creativity flows from the yes and of building on each other's voices when there isn't a sense of competition, which the free form tends to do. This is part of the challenge that we witnessed in consensus, is that when you have, particularly in large groups, which co-housing would tend to be, but in a larger group, you go, I call here, here, and here, and people speak, and what they do is they debate each other. They don't necessarily listen. And then a good facilitator will say, okay, let's hear from people we haven't heard from. You go here, here, and here, and they do the same thing, debate, which again, not necessarily do a creative building, but it can. So always leaving the option open for that free form. The other, I think the building capacity has to do with a couple of things. One is selection of people to roles. So the way selection of people to roles goes, for example, selecting somebody to the role of facilitator, we start off with saying, well, what are the qualities that we would want in someone who's going to play a role of facilitator? Okay, we want someone who listens well, one who can summarize, one who can really support, all the voices. So we're naming all the qualities, and then we're going around and saying, okay, I nominate Mark because, I've witnessed him in a number of meetings, and I see how he can really sort of put together what different people have said and say it back in a way that everybody goes, yes, okay, I feel understood here. So we're giving a lot of feedback to each other about how we operate in groups. And that, to me, is leadership development. Learning how to give feedback, receive feedback, and giving and receiving feedback creates the opportunity for growth, for development, which then can be done intentionally through, through whatever the evaluation of the meetings or role performance, improvement reviews, where we talk about what somebody's specifically doing well, what they could improve, and then collectively thinking about, how to support them in their improvement. Which again, things like having them go to an aorta workshop or a class action workup as a way of a place to examining more their class or race consciousness, etc. Jennifer's pointing to me here that I don't know if it's the current president, it might be the past president of the National Society, the National Sociocratic Organization of the Children in India, was blind. So, and she, what's that saying? She went to the United Nations and talked at the United Nations. So just to notice that someone who would not have been thought about as a leader because of gender, because of disability, and particularly in the cultures of India, could rise up through the selection processes and be seen as the leader of the organization, in an entire nation. So that's part of an answer. Mark, anything you want to follow up on that?
Thank you.
Okay. The other thing I could say is, as an organization, not just as individuals, because that was talking about individuals. As an organization, the aims of the organization are really what you're there for. What is our purpose? And in the context of accomplishing our purpose, what do we need to be doing? Well, we need a certain level, we need consciousness about communication skills, about racism and sexism and how those live in us and how we operate. So what are we going to intentionally do about that? Well, we're going to intentionally do some workshops among ourselves. We're going to intentionally do some disclosure about our histories and lives so that when we hear each other in the group, we're listening in a different level. This was really made clear to me a while ago when someone who would kind of meander in the way they talked, and it was like, okay, they're talking again. I start getting restless. I want them to get to the point. But they talked about this as their own pattern that they were aware of. And that they were aware of that pattern themselves, and they were doing the best they can. And this is just the way their mind worked, that they couldn't just go to the linear place and come to the conclusion that I might have wanted to just say. Their vulnerability in talking about themselves in that way created in me much more space to welcome them as they were. Now, I wish I could have had that consciousness even before they spoke, but at least, I could learn from their self-disclosure, their vulnerability, and go like, oh, okay. When this person speaks, I relax more and let them, know that they're going to come to the point because they're working through that. So that's what you can do when you're sociocracy, decisions made by those who work together, who associate together. Because you are connected to each other, you start knowing more about each other and your patterns and how you work, and can hear in a different quality level than when you're simply voting, for somebody you don't even know to represent you in government, or the winners and losers, when it's more about popularity than about really deeply understanding who we are and how we connect to each other. give Anna another closing word and wave hands and say goodbye. And anybody who wants to leave can leave. But anybody who wants to stay, I'm happy to stay longer and chat with you, kind of, have you all speak for yourselves instead of just reading Zoom chat comments. Anne, anything you want to say closing wise here?
I'm happy to email along some tools and some next steps for folks that are interested in getting to know class actions work a little more.
Great.
But thank you. It was a really big group, and I'm glad so many of you were able to make it today.